Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Just before sunrise on October 7th, 2023, the Gaza border looked almost ordinary. An observation tower stood against the pale sky, its rails still cool a half-finished cup of coffee beside a pair of binoculars left behind by a soldier stepping out to stretch. The desert air felt motionless, the kind of stillness that lasts only seconds before a day decides to fracture. At 6:30 a.m., the first rockets carved burning paths through the dawn. Sirens snapped awake across southern Israel as the Iron Dome fired upward in frantic bursts that could not keep pace. Small drones descended on surveillance towers, dropping charges that blinded Israel's early warning grid in seconds and turned command rooms into walls of empty screens. Then the breaches erupted. Fighters on motorcycles and pickup trucks surged through cut fences as paragliders drifted above them, their wings catching the first gold of sunrise, while targeting bases never built for an attack from the air. Along the coast near Zikim, speedboats slammed into the shoreline militants racing inland in a coordinated assault from land, air, and sea. In the border communities, violence arrived before anyone understood what they were hearing. Doors splintered, radios spat broken distress codes, and safe rooms filled with families clutching phones that could not reach emergency lines. At the music festival near Reim, celebration turned to panic as thousands fled across open fields, leaving tents, shoes, and backpacks scattered behind them like markers of a broken morning. Outposts fought in fragments. Some soldiers fired through shattered windows, unsure who was advancing through the smoke, while others barricaded themselves in darkened rooms as militants moved along hallways above and below. Hostages were taken in homes, on roadsides, and in bases overwhelmed too quickly for reinforcements to arrive. Videos appeared online within minutes, confirming what silence on the radios already suggested: this was not infiltration, it was a collapse. By mid-morning, Prime Minister Netanyahu appeared on television and declared that Israel was at war. Reservists sped south while the country watched the rising columns of smoke along the horizon. When the sun finally climbed above the border, the observation tower that had greeted the dawn stood bent and blackened, the spilled coffee evaporating on hot metal, and a long shadow stretching across the torn fence, marking the exact moment routine had snapped into catastrophe. At first, regional commanders misread the chaos as familiar border friction. Fragmented reports of gunfire near Reim, disabled towers at Nahal Oz, and sudden surveillance blackouts seemed like isolated incidents rather than a coordinated assault. But within minutes, the fragments aligned into a pattern no one could mistake: dozens of breaches, dozens of distress codes, dozens of communities reporting fighters already inside their streets. Frontline bases were fighting blind. In Nahal Oz, militants reached barracks before coherent orders could be issued, while near Zikim defenders clashed with attackers landing from the sea under the buzz of drones. Radios dissolved into overlapping pleas for support and warnings of collapsing positions, the noise smothering any sense of structure. Units held stairwells, corridors, or single rooms for minutes at a time before being overrun. Kibbutzim defense squads made up of teachers, mechanics, and retirees scrambled into makeshift perimeters. They fired from rooftops and dragged furniture against doors while guiding neighbors into reinforced rooms. Inside homes, parents whispered instructions to their children as windows shook from nearby gunfire. Each unanswered message on their phones felt heavier than the last. Israel's emergency hotlines buckled immediately. Operators struggled to respond to festival survivors hiding in fields, drivers ambushed on rural roads, and families trapped behind locked safe room doors. Helicopters scrambled from northern bases but found skies thick with smoke and roads choked with civilians fleeing in every direction. Every minute stretched the gap between those calling for help and those able to reach them. Zikim Beach became its own battlefront. Naval personnel exchanged close-range fire with militants emerging from burned boats, pulling wounded behind shipping crates as bullets snapped across the pier. Inland, the festival grounds near Ram turned silent, dotted with overturned cars and abandoned belongings that showed the path thousands had taken while running for their lives. Rescue teams arriving later followed those trails outward like spokes of a shattered wheel. Inside Israel's military headquarters, disbelief collided with urgency as red icons multiplied across screens that normally pulsed in steady rhythms. intelligence officers struggled to reconcile what they were seeing with years of assessments that had dismissed Hamas's ability to coordinate such a strike. By late morning, armored units finally reached several besieged communities. Families emerged, shaken, some in tears, others silent, while a single IDF helmet lay upright in the sand near the Gaza fence, its chin strap swaying in the warm wind like it was waiting for the soldier who would never return. The shockwave that tore through the south spread across Israel within minutes. Phones buzzed on nightstands in cafes, on buses, and grocery aisles as the national alert flashed across millions of screens, infiltration in progress, shelter immediately. Traffic froze mid-intersection while families abandoned shopping carts, bicycles, and morning plans all at once. The shift from routine to survival felt instantaneous. Reservists reacted first. Many had already seen fragments of the attack circulating online and recognized the scale before official statements arrived. Others woke to frantic calls, pulled uniforms from closets, and sped toward bases with hazard lights blinking. In apartment stairwells and underground garages, families huddled with radios and news feeds that updated slower than events were unfolding on the ground. Hospitals braced for mass casualties long before ambulances reached them. Triage zones expanded into hallways as doctors worked with steady hands and hollow expressions treating the first wave of wounded who arrived covered in dust blood and disbelief. Nurses taped handwritten signs directing crowds through corridors that had transformed into emergency wards in minutes. No one knew how many more were coming. Across the country, police firefighters and municipal workers mobilized without waiting for orders. Off-duty crews returned early, clearing intersections and reinforcing shelters so emergency vehicles could move freely. Neighborhoods formed spontaneous support networks, handing water to responders and guiding residents toward reinforced rooms. The machinery of civilian life twisted itself into wartime shape. At Israel's air bases, urgency grew into a roar. F-16s and F-35s lifted into smoke-streaked skies, heading toward Gaza in tight formations. Patriot batteries repositioned and additional Iron Dome launchers deployed in minutes instead of hours. Along highways leading south, armored brigades moved in long columns, engines rumbling like a continuous thunder rolling toward the front. Inside intelligence units, analysts worked with a different kind of desperation. They reviewed signals, intercepts, and satellite images, reconstructing the attack's coordination drones, disabling surveillance towers, synchronized breaches along the fence, paragliders targeting high-value posts, and militants navigating border towns with rehearsed precision. The shock came not only from what Hamas had done, but from how thoroughly Israel had underestimated the possibility. For civilians, the emotional rupture deepened with every alert. Reinforced rooms filled with neighbors scrolling through raw, unfiltered videos, spreading faster than official announcements. People listened to sirens rising over Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, sensing that the country had crossed an irreversible threshold. Inside an underground government chamber in Jerusalem, ministers debated with raised voices as maps showed expanding red zones across the south. By midday, mobilization was complete. Schools closed, businesses shuttered, and highways turned into rivers of military convoys stretching toward the border. Israel had shifted from a Saturday morning routine into its largest wartime posture in decades. A single plume of smoke drifting northward from Gaza followed the wind across the sky, marking the beginning of a war no one yet understood and no one could imagine ending soon. When Israel announced a complete siege on Gaza, the word spread faster than the power outages themselves. Lights flickered across entire neighborhoods before vanishing, leaving families standing in sudden darkness that felt heavier than the night outside. Generators sputtered for a few strained minutes before dying one by one. The hum of daily life collapsed into a mechanical silence, broken only by distant concussions. Hospitals were the first to feel the choke. Neonatal units unplugged from failing grids as nurses switched to hand-operated ventilators, their arms trembling under the weight of time. Surgeons worked beneath dim emergency lamps, stitching wounds in shifting shadows, while families crowded hallways searching for space near doctors. With fuel dwindling, every hour felt like a wager against the dark. Airstrikes struck northern Gaza in steady rhythms. Dust plumes drifted through alleys where residents moved cautiously, emerging from shelters only long enough to check if their homes still stood. Some carried infants wrapped in blankets. Others held bread under their arms like something fragile. Above them, jets carved echoing arcs that made every corner feel unsafe. Then the evacuation order swept across the city. Leaflets fell through the air like pale ash, instructing more than 1 million residents to move south. Loudspeakers repeated the message from mosques, their voices crackling over shattered neighborhoods. Families hesitated at doorways, torn between fear of staying and fear of the road ahead. But within hours, entire districts were on the move. The Salah al-Din highway filled with a slow procession stretching far beyond sight. Elderly men leaned on younger relatives, while mothers balanced children on hips and water jugs in their arms. Cars crawled along debris-choked shoulders, their trunks tied shut with strips of fabric. Dust clung to faces until everyone looked the same muted shade of gray. Night brought a deeper kind of darkness. With electricity gone, Gaza became a mosaic of shadows, lit only by burning buildings and phone screens held aloft in search of signal. Schools and mosques turned into crowded shelters, where mats lay edge to edge on bare floors. Volunteers boiled water over makeshift fires while children tried to sleep through the rattle of artillery rolling beneath the ground. Communications faltered and then buckled. Internet connections blinked in and out like dying heartbeats. People climbed onto rooftops, holding phones toward the sky, hoping a single message would go through. Most tried to send only one word alive. For many, the screen stayed blank. By the time the last generators failed and northern Gaza went fully dark, the silence felt almost physical. On the roof of a shattered apartment block, a metal clothesline swayed in the wind, its empty pins tapping against one another in a slow, uneven rhythm. It sounded like a clock that no longer measured hours, only the distance between one strike and the next. When Israeli ground forces entered northern Gaza, commanders knew the real battle waited below the rubble. The tunnels long described as smuggling routes revealed themselves as something far more complex. Reinforced corridors, storage chambers, and branching shafts formed an underground grid built to absorb bombardment and outmaneuver a modern army. The surface was only half the battlefield. The terrain itself struck first. Soldiers advancing across collapsed streets felt hollow vibrations under their boots as scanners returned chaotic readings that mapped more confusion than clarity. A tunnel might run a few meters beneath one block and plunge far deeper beneath the next, turning the ground into a layered maze with no dependable structure. The enemy could be anywhere beneath them. Inside these passages, Hamas fighters moved with practiced quiet. Cloth wrapped around their shoes muffled their steps as they navigated narrow corridors lit by dim bulbs powered from hidden generators. They emerged through trapdoors disguised as shattered tiles, fired and vanished again before troops above understood where the attack originated. Sealing one entrance simply meant 2 others remained unseen. Israel lowered robots into tunnel mouths, but many returned with only seconds of shaky footage before disappearing into static. When soldiers descended themselves, they moved slowly, tracing walls slick with condensation and listening for echoes that might signal an ambush or a dead end. The air grew heavier with each meter downward, and the darkness felt close enough to touch. Some rooms revealed the underground war more clearly than any briefing. Crates of ammunition were stacked like warehouse inventory, and crude maps drawn on cardboard showed connections between surface neighborhoods and deeper command nodes. In a few chambers, blankets and personal items hinted that hostages had been held there, a discovery that reshaped anxiety far beyond the battlefield. The deeper units pushed the more dangerous the tunnels became. Hidden charges wired into bottlenecks could bring entire sections down with a single misstep. Some passages were too narrow for protective vests, others too steep to climb quickly under fire. Each meter required deliberate claustrophobic progress through a space designed to erase the advantages of conventional armies. Above Gaza City, the effect of the tunnel network manifested in the landscape itself. Streets shifted as voids collapsed beneath them, and entire buildings tilted at unnatural angles. A water tower toppled sideways after an underground blast reverberated upward, falling in slow motion and sending a pale cloud of dust drifting for blocks. The city seemed to sag under the weight of the world below. By the time Israeli forces mapped even a fraction of the labyrinth, one truth had settled across every unit: defeating an enemy hiding in darkness meant entering that darkness themselves. Progress was measured in meters, not streets, and each step carried the weight of a war fought in two dimensions, one above ground and one buried deep beneath it. When the fighting shifted south toward Khan Yunis, the war compressed into something denser and more suffocating than before. The city had absorbed waves of displaced families, and its tight grid of alleys and high-rises offered militants countless places to hide and counterattack. Airstrikes turned pastel buildings into gray silhouettes, while ash settled over rooftops like a second skin. Every street felt narrower than the day before. Inside the Nasser Medical Complex, the last major hospital still functioning in the south, the pressure mounted hour by hour. Hallways filled with stretchers while families slept along stairwells waiting for news of loved ones. Surgeons operated under flickering lights and with supplies dwindling faster than they could be replenished. Every blast outdoors sent dust rolling through broken windows, coating beds in a thin layer of grit. Militants used the city's density as a shield. Anti-tank teams fired from gaps in collapsed walls, disappearing down stairwells that linked to tunnel mouths beneath apartment blocks. Israeli units advanced on foot, where armor could not pass clearing homes room by room as sniper fire cracked between exposed balconies. Drones circled overhead like mechanical sentries, tracking movement in streets too dangerous for patrols. For civilians, survival meant constant movement. UN schools overflowed with families laying mats from door to door, while tents spread across empty lots, orchards, and sidewalks. Water lines stretched through intersections where buildings leaned like broken teeth. Children wandered among debris, searching for anything useful, while parents rationed food with quiet precision. The city felt like it was shrinking around the people trying to endure it. Near the Hamad Towers, the fighting reached brutal intensity. Israeli soldiers moved through fractured hallways where entire floors had collapsed into glowing pits below. Fires burned through apartments, sending columns of black smoke spiraling between towers like a rising storm. Each advance came with the risk of a sudden ambush from a tunnel entrance, hidden behind a fallen cupboard or beneath a cracked tile. As the weeks passed, front lines shifted unpredictably. A street contested in the morning might be flattened by evening, leaving only jagged foundations to mark where homes once stood. Survivors searched the rubble for missing relatives, digging with their hands or crawling into pockets of broken concrete, calling out names that went unanswered. Rescue crews listened for faint tapping beneath slabs that groaned with every touch. Khan Younis became more than a battleground. It became the city where the humanitarian collapsed the tunnel war and the urban fight converged into a single overwhelming rupture. In a small park once filled with laughter, a lone swing hung half-buried in dust, swaying softly in the wind, as if trying to remember the children who once played there. As the devastation in Khan Younis deepened, the war spilled far beyond Gaza's borders and into the global consciousness. Images of collapsed towers, wounded children, and families fleeing under smoke dominated front pages from Paris to Jakarta. Protests surged across major capitals, with crowds filling public squares in waves of anger, grief, and solidarity. What began as a regional conflict quickly became a worldwide moral battleground. Human rights organizations released urgent reports alleging unlawful strikes and rising civilian casualties. At the United Nations, emergency sessions devolved into tense exchanges as delegations split sharply on responsibility and restraint. Draft resolutions stalled behind vetoes and diplomatic maneuvering that revealed fractures between world powers. Even seasoned diplomats struggled to keep pace with the outrage pouring in from streets across dozens of countries. In Western cities, domestic politics collided with foreign policy. Demonstrations in London, New York, Berlin, and Toronto grew larger by the day, sometimes divided by police lines separating opposing narratives. Some groups demanded immediate ceasefires, others condemned Hamas's atrocities or called for the release of hostages. Governments tried to balance shifting public pressure with security alliances that had taken decades to build. Across the Middle East, anger intensified. Jordan and Turkey summoned Israeli ambassadors, and several Arab states suspended diplomatic initiatives that only months earlier had been hailed as breakthroughs. On the Lebanon border, Hezbollah exchanges with Israel threatened to ignite a second front. Iran-aligned militias carried out attacks across Iraq and Syria, drawing American strikes that risked widening the conflict even further. Humanitarian groups struggled to deliver aid under increasingly dangerous conditions. Convoys backed up at the Rafah crossing as drivers slept inside their trucks for days awaiting clearance. When the gates opened, crowds surged toward water, flour, and medicine more quickly than distribution teams could organize. Aid workers described scenes of parents pushing through crushes with infants in their arms, elderly men collapsing from exhaustion, and children pleading for water. Jewish communities around the world faced a surge in anti-Semitic incidents. Synagogues increased security while families debated whether to hide religious symbols in public. At the same time, Palestinian diaspora communities lived in fear for relatives in Gaza, refreshing their phones for messages that arrived less frequently with each passing blackout. For many, the war resurrected old anxieties that transcended borders. Amid the noise of global statements and political positioning, one image captured the world's emotional center. A young Palestinian boy stood in the ruins of a school in Khan Younis, holding a torn notebook against his chest as dust settled in his hair. Behind him, the sky smeared with smoke. The picture spread across every platform, not as propaganda or argument, but as a quiet reminder of what had already been lost and what the world was struggling to prevent from happening again. In the hours after October 7th, as Israel counted its dead, another horror surfaced. Hundreds of civilians and soldiers had been dragged across the border into Gaza, taken from homes, cars, outposts, and the music festival. Their faces appeared on posters across Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, taped to bus stops, pinned to walls, and held by families who gathered in the streets each night. The country's grief gained a second heartbeat, one for the dead and one for the missing. Beneath Gaza, the hostages entered a world without clocks. Hamas fighters moved them through narrow tunnels lit by battery lamps, hiding them in small chambers carved into the earth. Some rooms held terrified groups whispering to each other in the dark. Others kept individuals alone with their thoughts and the distant echo of explosions above. Later testimony described the same disorienting rhythm, fear, silence, and time that no longer felt real. In Israel, their families became an unstoppable force. Hostage Square in Tel Aviv grew into a nightly vigil of candles, photographs, and megaphones held by parents whose voices trembled between rage and hope. They demanded answers from the government and pressured the war cabinet to prioritize a deal. Every speech, every march, every interview added weight to a national question no military operation could avoid. Negotiations began behind closed doors. Qatar, Egypt, and the United States shuttled messages between Israel and Hamas, navigating red lines that shifted with each passing day. Israel demanded proof of life and the return of children and elderly captives. Hamas demanded prisoner releases and guarantees of humanitarian access. Talks advanced, stalled, collapsed, and restarted as both sides tried to bend time to their advantage. The breakthrough came in late November. A temporary pause was agreed to hostages for prisoners' aid for access. When the first buses crossed back into Israel, families surged forward, reaching for loved ones who stepped off blinking into the sunlight after weeks underground. Doctors guided them gently to medical tents, where shadows under their eyes spoke louder than words. The country exhaled for the first time since the war began. Across the West Bank, Palestinian prisoners released from Israeli jails were met with crowds waving flags and chanting their names. Mothers held sons close, while children wrapped their arms around fathers who had spent years behind bars. The reunions mirrored those in Israel, joy and ache tightly woven together. Both sides celebrated even as the fragility of the truce hovered like a warning. But the pause was temporary. Disagreements over release lists, surveillance limits, and the movement of fighters through southern Gaza stalled further exchanges. At dawn on December 1st, the truce collapsed as airstrikes resumed and rockets fired back into Israel. The remaining hostages were thrust once more into darkness, both literal and political, while their families returned to Hostage Square to relight candles that had burned short during the brief moment of hope. Chairs with names taped to their backs stood empty beneath the flickering light. They waited in silent rows, each one a reminder that the clock had restarted, and no one knew how much time was left for those still trapped beneath Gaza. For a brief moment in late November, Gaza exhaled. After weeks of bombardment, the sky cleared into a pale blue that felt almost unreal. Families emerged from shelters blinking like they had stepped into a different season, unsure whether the quiet was safety or just an intermission. Children wandered between debris piles while parents whispered warnings not to stray far. It was calm, but not peace. A pause held together by conditions everyone knew could unravel in minutes. The ceasefire's purpose was narrow release, hostages deliver aid, buy time for diplomacy. Israeli forces held their lines around the Strip, while Hamas fighters stayed in their tunnels, repositioning hostages in tandem with negotiations. Trust was thin. Every hour depended on both sides honoring terms neither fully believed the other would keep. Even the air felt conditional, as if waiting for the first spark. Aid convoys finally crossed through Rafah in meaningful numbers. Crowds surged toward trucks carrying flower water and medicine overwhelming distribution teams before they could organize. Doctors treated wounds that had gone untended for weeks and handed children clean water that tasted unfamiliar after months of scarcity. For a few days, Gaza remembered pieces of routine, a warm meal, a conversation that lasted more than a minute's sleep without concussions rattling the ground. In Israel, the country held its breath as hostage lists were released each night. Families gathered around television searching for familiar names and faces among those returning home. Joy erupted in some living rooms as loved ones stepped off buses wrapped in blankets. Others went silent, staring at lists where their child or parent still did not appear. The nation lived suspended between relief and anguish. Behind closed doors, negotiations twisted into knots. Israel demanded more hostages before extending the pause. Hamas insisted on larger prisoner releases and broader guarantees on fuel and aid. Mediators from Qatar and Egypt shuttled proposals back and forth, watching each attempt buckle under mutual suspicion. It took only a few conflicting accusations to break the fragile balance. At dawn on December the 1st, the ceasefire collapsed. Explosions rolled across southern Gaza, sending families scrambling to repack belongings they had barely unpacked. Rocket sirens wailed again in Israeli towns near the border. The return to war was instant and brutal, as if the pause had never existed at all. Within days, water shortages overcrowded shelters, and mass displacement surged once more. Israeli ground forces resumed operations with renewed force, pushing deeper into southern districts where militants had regrouped during the pause. Gaza's hospitals already stretched thin-buckled under a new wave of casualties. Families moved again, some for the fourth or fifth time, carrying fewer belongings with each relocation. The brief taste of stillness made the return to chaos even harsher. On a ruined street near Younis, soldiers later found a single mattress lying perfectly intact amid collapsed walls. Someone had made it neatly during the ceasefire corners, tucked blankets smoothed, as if preparing for a night of rest that never came. Dust settled over it softly, muting its colors into gray. It remained untouched, a quiet monument to a peace too fragile to survive the dawn. While Gaza consumed global attention, another front simmered dangerously along Israel's northern border. Hezbollah intensified its operations in calibrated bursts, firing rockets into Galilee, launching anti-tank missiles at IDF positions, and sending drones across the frontier. Each strike was deliberate, designed to bleed without triggering all-out war. Yet every exchange pushed the region closer to a line neither side wanted to cross. Northern towns emptied within days. Entire communities packed bags and drove south on highways that felt more like evacuation corridors than roads. Streets that once hosted weekend markets now sat silent playgrounds, abandoned shutters drawn tight against the threat from across the hills. Israel declared large swaths of the border uninhabitable, moving thousands of families into hotels, gyms, and temporary shelters far from home. The IDF redeployed significant forces to the northern sector. Troops dug new defensive lines across ridgelines overlooking Lebanon, reinforcing artillery posts and scanning for movement along valleys where Hezbollah fighters shifted like shadows. Each night the sky flickered with the glow of intercepted rockets, the distant booms echoing across Galilee. Residents of Haifa and Tiberias slept lightly, aware the front could ignite without warning. In Lebanon, the cost mounted as well. Villages near the border emptied under Israeli artillery fire, and families sheltered in basements converted into improvised bunkers. Schools shut down hospitals, rationed supplies, and farmers abandoned olive groves as clashes escalated. Lebanese officials pleaded for de-escalation, knowing their weakened economy could not absorb another war. But Hezbollah, tied to Tehran's wider regional posture, continued its pressure campaign. Iran's shadow grew behind every shot fired. Proxy militias in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen launched attacks on American bases and Red Sea shipping lanes, prompting retaliatory strikes that risked expanding the conflict. Washington warned of a regional ignition point while diplomats scrambled to contain what felt increasingly like a network of interconnected fires. One miscalculation could bind the fronts together. Inside Israel's war cabinet, the northern dilemma deepened strategic divides. Some ministers argued that absorbing Hezbollah's attacks without a decisive response invited greater danger. Others warned that opening a second major front would stretch the IDF beyond sustainable limits while hostages remained underground in Gaza. Displaced families protested outside government buildings demanding a timeline for return, but no official could offer one. The turning point came when a Hezbollah missile struck an Israeli command vehicle, killing several soldiers. Retaliatory strikes followed, instantly leveling observation posts and munition sites across southern Lebanon. For a moment, both sides hovered on the edge of full-scale war. Diplomats intervened in a flurry of midnight calls and channels from Beirut to Tel Aviv, worked to pull both militaries back from the brink. The tempo eased, but only slightly. Exchanges continued at a lower intensity enough to keep entire border towns deserted. By late December, the Northern Front settled into a tense, unresolved standoff that felt less like peace and more like a fuse stretching along the mountains. One night, as tracer rounds arced across the horizon, a cold wind sweeping over a hillside outpost, an Israeli soldier warming his hands whispered, "This isn't a front. It's a fuse." By early 2024, diplomacy had become a relentless circuit of flights and midnight meetings. Envoys moved between Doha, Cairo, Tel Aviv, and Washington, with proposals already rejected in previous rounds, yet they kept returning because the alternative was a regional rupture no one could afford. Each delegation arrived exhausted, carrying briefcases full of drafts that could collapse over a single misplaced word. Every conversation felt like a negotiation with time itself. Qatar remained central to the hostage talks. Its mediators carried handwritten notes, encrypted messages, and verbal assurances between parties who refused direct contact. The smallest dispute over sequencing release lists or proof of life could stall progress for days. Egypt faced its own crisis as Israeli operations crept toward Rafah, raising fears of a mass spillover of refugees into Sinai. Cairo reinforced its border with tanks and drones, quietly warning Israel not to push further south. In Washington, the Biden administration struggled to balance unwavering support for Israel with growing alarm over civilian casualties. High-level officials shuttled to the region, repeatedly pressing Israel to open humanitarian corridors and limit strikes near crowded districts. At the same time, American aircraft carriers patrolled the eastern Mediterranean to deter Hezbollah and Iran from expanding the conflict. Every move required its opposite, a constant balancing act between pressure and protection. Europe fractured under public pressure. Some governments pushed urgently for ceasefires, while others prioritized Israel's security, leading to cabinet splits that spilled into parliament debates and street protests. Social media amplified every misstep, every civilian death, every stalled negotiation. Diplomats who once worked behind the scenes found themselves navigating a global audience watching in real time. Meanwhile, Gaza's humanitarian collapse accelerated beyond what traditional diplomacy could manage. UN agencies warned of imminent famine in northern districts where food deliveries rarely arrived. Hospitals functioned at a fraction of capacity, many reduced to a single lit room powered by batteries. Aid convoys bottlenecked along the Egyptian border as negotiators argued over inspection protocols and fuel allowances. The humanitarian crisis became a diplomatic crisis of its own. Regional tensions widened further. Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping disrupted global trade routes, forcing vessels to reroute thousands of kilometers around Africa. The United States and its allies intercepted drones and missiles, expanding the war's economic footprint into international waters. Every strike connected to another, forming a chain of instability that diplomacy struggled to contain. Inside Israel, political fractures deepened as military goals collided with diplomatic realities. Some ministers pushed to dismantle the remaining Hamas battalions in Rafah, regardless of international pressure. Others warned that without a political plan for Gaza's future, continued operations could trap Israel in an endless cycle of urban warfare. Hostage families intensified their protests, demanding the government accept broader compromises to bring their loved ones home. In a late-night meeting in Cairo, after hours of deadlocked discussion, a senior Egyptian negotiator leaned back in his chair and spoke quietly, almost to himself. "This is no longer diplomacy," he said. "This is firefighting." No one in the room disagreed. As winter gave way to spring, the war stopped feeling like a sequence of phases and became something heavier. Gaza's landscape changed in slow collapses rather than dramatic shifts. Buildings that had survived earlier strikes finally crumbled, and new tent camps spread across empty lots, orchards, and roadsides. Humanitarian corridors opened and closed with little warning. Nothing reset. Everything accumulated. In April, the shadow war stepped into the light. For the first time, Iran launched hundreds of drones and missiles directly at Israel, turning the night sky into a field of fire. Most were intercepted by Israel, the United States, and allied air defenses, but the message was unmistakable. The rules of engagement in the Middle East had changed forever. In northern Gaza, Israeli forces tried to stabilize areas cleared months earlier, but stability proved impossible. Militants re-emerged through hidden tunnel links, ambushing patrols, or planting explosives along supply routes. Streets declared safe one week were contested the next. Civilians attempting to revisit their homes found themselves navigating a patchwork of shifting checkpoints and unpredictable flare-ups. Further south, Khan Younis sank deeper into devastation. Engineers detonated tunnel shafts that triggered secondary blasts, leaving new craters the size of courtyards. Entire neighborhoods twisted into shapes drones struggled to interpret. Palestinians who had fled from the north now fled again, carrying fewer belongings each time as they moved toward Rafah or makeshift shelters built from tarps and scavenged wood. Disease spread faster than aid. Respiratory infections, skin diseases, and dehydration swept through overcrowded shelters. Doctors treated children who no longer recognized the feeling of being full. Aid workers described scenes like overlapping disasters, as if earthquakes and bombings had struck the same place simultaneously. Inside Israel, the emotional temperature hardened. The horror of October 7th remained a constant reference point shaping debates about what the war must achieve. Protests grew larger, calling for elections accountability or hostage deals depending on the night. The sense of unity forged in the early weeks had dissolved into competing visions of how the war should end. Rafah became the final hinge of the conflict. Over 1 million Palestinians crowded into the city's narrow grid, forming what aid groups called the densest camp on earth. A single strike could ripple across dozens of families. International pressure intensified as Israel argued that Hamas's remaining battalions and leadership elements were entrenched there. By mid-2024, the conflict had settled into its endurance phase. No development ended the fighting, yet each day deepened the cost. Gaza's future remained uncertain, Israel's politics increasingly volatile, and regional militias more active than ever. Nothing felt decisive. Everything felt heavy. By late 2024, the war had reshaped Israel as profoundly as it had reshaped Gaza. The unity forged in the shock of October 7th fractured under the pressure of prolonged conflict, political deadlock, and the unresolved hostage crisis. What had begun as a national rally hardened into a series of internal breaks, each one widening as the months dragged on. Grief became anger, and anger became division. The deepest fracture lay between the government and the families of the hostages. Night after night, Hostage Square filled with mothers holding megaphones and fathers gripping photographs of their children. Their chants echoed across Tel Aviv, demanding a deal at any cost. Officials promised progress, but delays eroded trust until families accused the government of prioritizing military objectives over the lives still trapped underground. Each unfulfilled promise sharpened the sense of betrayal. Political tensions widened the cracks. Opposition parties argued that Israel lacked a long-term strategy for Gaza, insisting that the war had become directionless. Supporters of the government countered that dismantling Hamas required patience and resolve. Televised debates devolved into shouting matches as protests filled major cities. Calls for elections grew louder, reflecting a public torn between despair determination, and distrust. Politics no longer ran parallel to the war. It ran through it. Reservists, the backbone of Israel's military response, carried a separate weight. Many had served for months with little rest returning home, only to be called back again. Families struggled with prolonged separations. Businesses faced collapse, and careers stalled indefinitely. Some soldiers privately questioned whether the war's goals were still attainable. Others believed stopping now would dishonor those killed on October 7th. Fatigue settled into the ranks like a second uniform. Within Israeli society, long-standing cultural tensions intensified. The debate over Haredi exemptions from military service became a flashpoint as hundreds of thousands of reservists remained on duty. Secular Israelis demanded conscription reform, arguing that the burden of war was being carried unevenly. Ultra-Orthodox leaders resisted, insisting that Torah study protected the nation in its own way. Marches on both sides drew thousands, turning the war into a referendum on national identity. Arab citizens of Israel faced their own pressures. Many feared speaking publicly about the conflict, worried about backlash or accusations of sympathy for Hamas. Some communities experienced heightened surveillance, while others withdrew inward, navigating old tensions made sharper by the violence in Gaza. The war tested social coexistence in ways not seen for years. Economically, the strain deepened. Tourism vanished. Technology companies shifted teams abroad. Northern towns displaced by Hezbollah's fire required long-term housing, driving rents higher nationwide. Restaurants and small shops closed. Families recalculated expenses with new anxiety. Daily life absorbed the war's weight, even far from the front. The psychological toll showed in smaller, quieter ways. Children startled at thunder, mistaking it for rocket fire. Couples argued over news coverage. Therapists saw wait lists surge as people sought help for grief, fear, or exhaustion. Memorials to October 7th grew across cities, candles burning beside photographs taped to walls and bus stops. The country lived in two emotional registers at once, pride and pain, layered so closely they became indistinguishable. By year's end, one truth hovered over Israel like a shadow. The war had ceased to be only external. It had turned inward, transforming political divides into cultural rifts and personal grief into national reckoning. Winning battles on the ground did not mend the fractures at home. Some wounds did not come from rockets or tunnels, but from mistrust, uncertainty, and the fear that the country was changing in ways no one yet understood. Israel was fighting two wars now, one across the border and one within itself. By the early months of 2025, the war no longer felt like a sequence of events. It had become an atmosphere that everyone breathed a weight that settled over Israel, Gaza, and the region with no sign of lifting. Explosions, evacuations, and diplomatic ruptures no longer shocked anyone. They simply continued forming a rhythm that felt impossible to break. Rafah emerged as the new center of gravity. Israeli commanders insisted the city held Hamas's remaining battalions and its last cohesive leadership. Yet over 1 million displaced Palestinians were packed into its narrow grid, pitching tents on sidewalks, rooftops, orchards, and open lots. Wind whipped through plastic sheets as families listened to distant artillery, unsure where to move next. Egypt watched with growing alarm. Every IDF advance toward the border fence raised fears of a mass spillover into Sinai, a scenario Cairo had warned against for months. Tanks and barriers reinforced the Egyptian side, while diplomats delivered unusually blunt messages to Israel. The regional balance rested on a line in the sand that everyone could see but no one fully trusted. Inside Gaza, humanitarian collapse turned into a way of life. Famine indicators spiked in northern districts where aid had barely trickled in. Parents boiled grass and animal feed into thin broth for children who had forgotten the feeling of fullness. Hospitals operated with battery lamps and sterilized tools over open flames, while sewage dust and smoke blended into a constant suffocating smell. Israel faced a different kind of pressure. Protests swelled again in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Haifa as families of hostages demanded a deal and reservists returned from the front lines exhausted. Some soldiers questioned whether the war still had a destination. Others believed stopping before Hamas was fully dismantled would guarantee future bloodshed. Daily life oscillated between determination and fatigue. Relations between Israel and the United States reached their tensest point in decades. Washington pushed hard for humanitarian safeguards and renewed hostage talks, while Israeli leaders argued that Hamas's remaining infrastructure could not be left intact. Leaked reports spoke of deep frustration inside the White House. Yet the strategic alliance held strained but intact, bound by mutual necessity. Across the region, the aftershocks kept spreading. Hezbollah's low-intensity campaign kept the northern border evacuated. Houthi missile attacks disrupted global shipping routes through the Red Sea, forcing vessels to reroute around Africa. Iranian-backed militias continued sporadic strikes on American positions. The Middle East resembled a chain of crises, each fueling the next. Through it all, the hostages remained the emotional gravity of Israel's war. Their fading posters hung on city walls while rumors leaked audio, or small discoveries inside tunnels swung national mood overnight. Every negotiation returned to them. Every debate circled back to their absence. Their shadows sat in every meeting room even when their chairs were empty. By mid-2025, the war's shape had shifted, but its essence had not. Gaza lay in ruins. Israel carried its own fractures, and the region hovered between escalation and exhaustion. Diplomats chased agreements that dissolved as quickly as they formed. Generals drafted plans that resembled holding patterns instead of endpoints. The conflict no longer felt linear, it felt orbital. On a warm night along the Gaza border, an Israeli soldier on watch listened to distant explosions echo across the dark. He had rotated through multiple fronts and felt older than his age by years. As the wind carried the scent of burning debris, he whispered to the soldier beside him, "If this is the middle, then the end must still be far away." In Rafah, a mother lit her last candle inside a tin can, its glow trembling over her children sleeping on packed earth. Two people on opposite sides of a border suspended in the same unending moment. The war had become gravity pulling everyone deeper with no clear path back to the surface.